August 3, 1944. 32,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler pushed his Messerschmitt BF-109 G6 into a shallow dive, attempting to close distance on a formation of P-51 Mustangs, escorting a box of B-17 bombers. His gloved hand eased the throttle forward, manifold pressure climbing toward the war emergency setting as he watched his airspeed indicator rise through 380 miles per hour. The Mustangs ahead had spotted him. They were turning. Stigler expected them to maneuver for position, to engage in the familiar dance of energy management and tactical geometry that defined fighter combat. What he did not expect was what happened next. The lead Mustang simply accelerated away, not gradually, not with the careful energy trades that characterized dogfighting. The American fighter increased speed so rapidly that Stigler's brain struggled to process what his eyes witnessed. Within seconds, the Mustang had opened the range by half a mile, then a mile, then disappeared into the haze, still accelerating. Stigler checked his instruments, confused. His Messerschmitt was running well, engine temperature normal, manifold pressure where it should be. He was flying at optimal altitude for the 109's performance, yet the American fighter had simply chosen to leave, and there was nothing Stigler could do to prevent it. He would later report this encounter to his squadron commander with careful professional language, describing the Mustang's acceleration as exceptional, unprecedented, impossible, according to the performance parameters German intelligence had established for American fighters. What Stigler did not know, what no German pilot yet understood in the summer of 1944, was that the Americans had changed the fundamental equation of aerial combat through chemical engineering rather than aircraft design. The Mustang that had effortlessly escaped his attack was running on 150-grade aviation fuel, a purple-dyed gasoline that provided performance characteristics so far beyond standard fuel capabilities that it rendered German intelligence estimates obsolete and German tactical doctrine increasingly futile. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation happened in laboratories and refineries far from any battlefield. American and British petroleum chemists working through 1943 had achieved something the German synthetic fuel program could never match, creating aviation gasoline with a performance number of 150. This designation, somewhat misleading because it suggested an octane rating of 150, which was chemically impossible, actually meant a fuel with a performance number of 150 on the rich mixture scale, combined with 100-octane performance on the lean mixture scale. The implications were profound. A Packard Merlin V1657, the engine powering the P-51D Mustang, generated 1,490 horsepower at standard military power, running on 130-grade fuel. The same engine running on 150-grade fuel at war, emergency power settings generated 1,720 horsepower. This represented a 15% power increase without changing a single component of the engine itself. More power meant higher top speed, better climb rate, superior acceleration, and tactical flexibility that German fighters simply could not match. The science underlying this advantage was straightforward, but the engineering required to produce such fuel at industrial scale was extraordinarily complex. Octane ratings measure detonation resistance. When a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture during the compression stroke, temperature and pressure increase dramatically. If fuel spontaneously ignites before the spark plug fires, the result is detonation, an uncontrolled explosion rather than a controlled burn. Detonation creates shock waves that damage or destroy engine components. Higher octane ratings mean fuel can withstand higher compression without detonating. Performance numbers measure how much better than pure isooctane a fuel can perform. A fuel with a performance number of 150 means it can withstand 50% more compression than pure isooctane before detonating. Creating such fuel required adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, and careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene with base gasoline. British fuel chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tested numerous blends through 1942 and 1943, seeking optimal combinations of anti-knock performance, energy content, and manufacturing practicality. American researchers at Wright Field conducted parallel investigations, sharing data with their British counterparts. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches of what they designated as 150-grade fuel. The purple dye added to this fuel served multiple practical purposes beyond mere identification. It prevented diversion to civilian use, marked aircraft that required special handling procedures, and provided immediate visual confirmation that ground crews were loading the correct fuel type into fighter aircraft. But the dye also became symbolic. Purple gasoline represented American industrial might, chemical engineering sophistication, and the accumulated advantages of nations with access to vast petroleum reserves, protected refineries, and uninterrupted production capacity. Testing through 1943 exceeded expectations. Merlin engines running on 150-grade fuel could sustain manifold pressure readings of 75 inches of mercury compared to 67 inches on 130-grade fuel. This translated directly into increased horsepower across the entire power band. Engineers at Wright Field conducted systematic performance testing using a P-51B as the test platform. At 25,000 feet, a Mustang running on standard 130-grade fuel achieved 437 miles per hour maximum speed. The same aircraft flown by the same test pilot at the same altitude running on 150-grade fuel exceeded 448 miles per hour. This 11-mile-per-hour increase represented more than a simple performance improvement. It represented the difference between a fighter that could engage German aircraft on roughly equal terms and a fighter that possessed categorical superiority in the most important tactical dimension. Speed in aerial combat determines who controls engagement geometry. A faster fighter can choose when to fight and when to escape. A slower fighter must accept combat on terms dictated by the faster opponent or attempt to evade through defensive maneuvers that bleed energy and tactical options. German fighter pilots who had learned to respect the Mustang's range and high-altitude performance were about to discover that Americans had fundamentally altered this equation. The Messerschmitt BF-109G, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter in early 1944, had a maximum speed of approximately 400 miles per hour at altitude when running on Germany's premium C3 fuel. The Focke-Wulf 190A could reach 408 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Against Mustangs running 130-grade fuel, German pilots could at least attempt engagement on favorable terms, using altitude advantage, tactical position, or numerical superiority, to create situations where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs could fight effectively, despite the Americans' performance advantages. Against Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, German fighters operated at a fundamental disadvantage that no amount of pilot skill or tactical cunning could overcome. The performance gap was simply too large. American pilots could dictate engagement terms absolutely. They could attack when circumstances favored them, escape when situations became unfavorable, and maintain position with bomber formations, regardless of German tactical attempts to separate escorts from bombers. The strategic implications were enormous. Throughout 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had conducted an increasingly costly daylight bombing campaign against German industrial targets. American doctrine emphasized precision bombing in daylight, believing that accurate strikes against specific factories, rail yards, and industrial facilities would cripple German war production more effectively than British nighttime area bombing. This doctrine required bombers to penetrate deep into German airspace during daylight hours when they were visible to fighters and anti-aircraft batteries. Initial raids proved devastating for American bomber crews. Without adequate fighter escort, B-17 and B-24 formations suffered catastrophic losses to German fighter attacks. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943, saw 60 bombers lost out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate exceeding 16%. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14 cost another 77 bombers, earning the mission the grim designation Black Thursday among surviving crews. These losses were operationally unsustainable. The 8th Air Force briefly considered abandoning daylight precision bombing entirely, acknowledging that without effective fighter escort deep into Germany, the strategic bombing campaign could not continue. The P-51 Mustang changed this calculation. Originally designed to a British specification by North American Aviation in 1940, the Mustang initially suffered from inadequate high-altitude performance due to its Allison engine's single-stage supercharger. British engineers recognized the airframe's exceptional aerodynamic efficiency and proposed mating it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output at high altitude. This combination created arguably the finest piston engine fighter of the Second World War. The P-51B with its Packard-built Merlin engine entered operational service with the 8th Air Force in December 1943. Its range, extended further by drop tanks, finally gave American bombers the deep escort they desperately needed. By March 1944, Mustangs were escorting bomber formations to Berlin and back, a range capability German planners had not thought possible for single-engine fighters. But range alone, while crucial, was not sufficient to achieve air superiority over Germany. Mustangs also needed to defeat German fighters in combat, to create conditions where Luftwaffe pilots faced unacceptable losses, attempting to attack bomber formations. This required not just adequate performance, but superior performance across multiple dimensions, including speed, climb rate, acceleration, and sustained power output at combat altitudes. 150-grade fuel provided exactly these advantages. Initial deliveries of the new fuel reached operational units in England during spring 1944. Distribution was carefully controlled, with priority given to P-51 groups that would fly the deepest penetration missions into Germany. Ground crews received specific instructions regarding handling procedures, storage requirements, and the importance of not contaminating 150-grade fuel with standard fuels. The purple color made visual verification straightforward, reducing the risk of accidental misfueling that could damage engines or reduce performance during critical combat operations. Pilots received briefings about the new fuel's capabilities and the associated performance improvements they could expect. Many approached these briefings with skepticism, having heard numerous optimistic claims about equipment improvements that failed to deliver promised results. Combat pilots learned to trust their own experiences more than official briefings. But 150-grade fuel was different. The performance improvements were immediate and unmistakable. Pilots reported that their Mustangs felt more powerful, more responsive, capable of acceleration and sustained speed that exceeded their previous experience. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commanding officer of the 352nd Fighter Group, flew one of the first combat missions with 150-grade fuel in April 1944. His after-action report described the Mustang's performance as dramatically improved, noting that he could maintain higher speeds at lower throttle settings and that acceleration during combat maneuvers exceeded anything he had previously experienced with the same aircraft type. Other pilots confirmed similar observations. The Mustangs simply felt faster, and instrument readings confirmed what pilots sensed. Airspeed indicators showed higher numbers at identical power settings and altitudes. Climb rates improved measurably. Most importantly, tactical flexibility increased. Pilots found they could execute maneuvers that had previously required careful energy management, confident that the additional power from 150-grade fuel provided sufficient margin to avoid entering dangerous low-energy states during combat. German pilots facing these improved Mustangs did not immediately understand what had changed. They knew American fighters had always been formidable, but in spring and summer 1944, something was different. Mustangs that had been fast were now faster. Pilots who had been dangerous were now more dangerous. The Germans attributed this to pilot experience, improved tactics, or perhaps new aircraft variants with unknown modifications. The true explanation remained hidden inside fuel tanks, invisible to external observation, impossible to detect without chemical analysis, that German forces had no opportunity to conduct on fuel samples from aircraft they rarely captured intact. Franz Stigler's experience above the Ruhr Valley was repeated hundreds of times across German airspace during summer and fall 1944. German fighter pilots attempted to engage American escorts using tactics that had previously worked, only to discover that tactical situations they had controlled now slipped away as Mustangs simply accelerated out of range, climbed away from attacks, or maintained positions relative to bomber formations that should have been impossible to hold against determined fighter attacks. The psychological impact was significant and demoralizing. Luftwaffe pilots had trained extensively. Many were combat veterans with multiple kills, and they flew aircraft that German propaganda assured them were world-class fighters capable of defeating any opponent. Yet American pilots in American fighters consistently demonstrated performance advantages that made German tactical doctrine increasingly irrelevant. This created cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. Either German pilots were inadequately trained and skilled, which did not match their own combat experience, or German aircraft were inferior to American types, which contradicted everything official communications claimed, or Americans possessed some advantage that German intelligence had failed to identify and quantify. The truth was the third option, but reaching that conclusion required German intelligence analysts to question fundamental assumptions about American industrial capabilities and technological sophistication. German planners had consistently underestimated American engineering prowess, viewing the United States as a nation focused on mass production and quantity rather than quality and innovation. This perception, rooted partly in ideological prejudice and partly in outdated pre-war assessments, blinded German leadership to the reality that America possessed both vast industrial capacity and sophisticated technical capabilities. The development of 150-grade fuel illustrated this perfectly. Creating such fuel required not just theoretical chemistry knowledge but also practical engineering expertise, specialized refinery equipment, reliable supply chains for critical chemical additives, and production management capable of scaling laboratory processes to industrial output measured in millions of gallons monthly. Germany's synthetic fuel program, while technically impressive in converting coal to gasoline using the Burgess process, could never match Allied natural petroleum refining for volume, cost, or product quality. By 1944, 17 Allied refineries were producing high-octane aviation gasoline using the catalytic cracking process perfected by French immigrant engineer Eugene Houdry. American refineries alone produced sufficient quantities to fuel the massive bomber offensive against Germany, the growing fighter forces protecting those bombers, training operations for new pilots, and stockpiling reserves for future operations. German fuel production, by contrast, remained bottlenecked by limited synthetic fuel plant capacity, vulnerability to Allied bombing, and resource constraints that affected every aspect of German war production. Most German fighters flew on B4 fuel, rated at approximately 91 octane on the lean mixture scale. Their premium C3 fuel, used primarily in BMW 801-powered Focke-Wulf 190s and select Messerschmitt variants, was roughly equivalent to Allied 130-grade fuel, but available in far more limited quantities. By 1944, perhaps two-thirds of German aviation fuel production was C3 grade, but this still represented only a small fraction of what the Allies produced. The operational consequences were severe and worsening. German fighter units often sat grounded not because aircraft were unavailable or pilots lacked missions to fly, but simply because insufficient fuel existed to support operations. When German fighters did sortie, they operated under strict fuel conservation measures that limited combat capability. A German pilot who burned too much fuel during combat might not have enough reserve to return to base, creating situations where pilots had to break off engagements, not because they were losing, but because fuel state dictated immediate return. Allied pilots, by contrast, could use full power when needed, confident that adequate fuel reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility had profound strategic implications. Allied fighters maintained standing patrols, reacted to threats aggressively, and sustained continuous operations. German fighters had to pick their moments carefully, conserve fuel rigidly, and often accept unfavorable tactical situations rather than risk fuel exhaustion. The introduction of 150-grade fuel amplified these existing disparities. Not only did German pilots face opponents with superior fuel availability, they now confronted opponents whose fuel provided superior performance, even when quantities were equal. the advantage was cumulative and decisive. Combat reports from Luftwaffe units during summer and fall 1944 reflect growing frustration and declining effectiveness. Major Heinz Baer, a highly experienced fighter pilot with over 200 victories, reported in August 1944 that American Mustangs demonstrated performance characteristics that exceeded German intelligence estimates by significant margins. He noted specifically that Mustangs could sustain speeds during combat that Messerschmitts could match only briefly at full emergency power, and that American pilots appeared willing to use full power freely, suggesting unlimited fuel supplies that German units could not imagine. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 77, reported similar observations. His unit's combat effectiveness declined steadily through 1944, despite receiving replacement pilots and aircraft. The problem was not lack of equipment or personnel, but rather fundamental performance disadvantages against American fighters that made successful bomber interceptions increasingly rare and costly. Steinhoff noted that his pilots reported American escorts maintaining formation positions that should have been impossible given the tactical maneuvers German fighters attempted to force separation between escorts and bombers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German attempts to counter these disadvantages through tactical innovation achieved limited success. Some units experimented with high-altitude diving attacks, hoping to use gravity-assisted speed to compensate for power deficits. This sometimes worked against bomber formations, but proved ineffective against alert escort fighters that could simply accelerate away from diving attackers, forcing German pilots to break off attacks and attempt to regain altitude, while American fighters maintained energy advantage. Other German units tried massed formation attacks, concentrating multiple groups to overwhelm escort fighters through numerical superiority. This approach occasionally succeeded in creating brief windows where bombers could be attacked, but it required extensive coordination, consumed enormous quantities of scarce fuel, and resulted in heavy German losses when American escorts engaged the massed formations. The loss-exchange ratios increasingly favored the Americans. By fall 1944, German fighter losses exceeded replacement capacity even as pilot training time decreased due to fuel shortages that limited flying hours for trainees. The Luftwaffe entered a death spiral where experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained, and replacement pilots lacked the experience to survive their first combat encounters, leading to even higher loss rates that accelerated the cycle. Against this deteriorating situation, American fighter groups, equipped with 150-grade fuel, achieved air superiority so complete that bomber formations sometimes flew deep into Germany without encountering any aerial opposition. When German fighters did attack, they usually suffered heavy losses for minimal results. Combat reports from this period show overwhelmingly one-sided outcomes. On October 7, 1944, during a major raid on Politz, American fighters claimed 102 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 9 American fighters. Similar lopsided results appeared throughout fall and winter 1944 through 1945. The 357th Fighter Group, equipped with P-51D Mustangs running 150-grade fuel, claimed 509 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and 605 destroyed on the ground between June 1944 and May 1945. The group lost 95 aircraft to all causes during this period, achieving a kill ratio exceeding 5-to-1 in air combat. These numbers reflected not just pilot skill or aircraft quality, but also the fundamental performance advantages that 150-grade fuel provided. Mustangs could engage when circumstances favored them, escape when situations became unfavorable, and maintain tactical positions that maximized their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. German pilots, by contrast, fought defensively, attempting to survive rather than achieve victory, knowing that each sortie might be their last, not because of enemy action but because there might not be fuel for another mission. The performance testing that German engineers conducted on captured P-51 seconds during this period provided additional confirmation of American advantages. A P-51D captured relatively intact near Munich in December 1944 underwent systematic evaluation at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility. German test pilots flew the Mustang extensively, measuring speed at various altitudes, climb rate throughout the altitude range, and handling characteristics across the complete performance envelope. Their reports confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting from actual engagements. The Mustang possessed significant performance advantages in the most critical categories. Maximum speed exceeded 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude. Climb rate from sea level to 25,000 feet was completed in 7 minutes. Range with drop tanks exceeded 1,000 miles, enabling bomber escort missions deep into Germany. Handling characteristics were harmonious and forgiving, reducing pilot workload during high-stress combat situations. German engineers noted specific design features that contributed to these capabilities, including the aerodynamically efficient wing design, developed using the NACA 23012 laminar flow airfoil, the powerful Packard Merlin engine with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained performance at high altitude, the large internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons, supplemented by external tanks carrying up to 108 gallons each, and thoughtful systems integration throughout the aircraft that reflected sophisticated engineering rather than crude mass production. What the German engineers could not determine through their testing was why captured Mustangs demonstrated slightly lower performance than combat pilots reported encountering during actual engagements. The captured aircraft, running on German C-3 fuel because no alternative existed, achieved respectable performance, but not the exceptional performance that combat reports documented. The Germans attributed this discrepancy to pilot error in combat reports, believing that stressed pilots overestimated enemy aircraft performance during the confusion of aerial combat. They did not suspect that American aircraft were running on fuel superior to anything available in German inventory, because such an advantage seemed implausible to engineers who understood that Germany possessed world-class chemical expertise and sophisticated fuel production capabilities. The possibility that Americans had achieved something Germany could not match challenged fundamental assumptions about German technical superiority. These assumptions died hard. Even as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated catastrophically through 1945, German propaganda continued asserting technical parity or superiority over Allied equipment. Pilots knew better. They flew the missions, faced the enemies, and understood from direct experience that German aircraft could not match American performance. But acknowledging this reality meant accepting that Germany was losing not through lack of courage or determination, but through material inferiority across multiple dimensions. The psychological burden of this recognition weighed heavily on pilots who continued fighting despite knowing the war was lost. Some became fatalistic, flying each mission as potentially their last, finding meaning in professional competence rather than belief in victory. Others became bitter, resentful of leadership that had led Germany into an unwinnable war against opponents with overwhelming advantages. A few sought ways to survive until war's end, avoiding unnecessary risks while maintaining the appearance of fulfilling their duties. Major Günther Rohl, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, later recalled the profound demoralization that pervaded fighter units during the war's final year. Pilots understood they were losing, understood why they were losing, and understood that nothing they could do individually would change strategic outcomes. Yet they continued flying because military discipline, personal honor, and commitment to protecting German cities from bombing demanded it. The contrast between German and Allied situations in late 1944 and early 1945 was stark and demoralizing. Allied fighters flew multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and aircraft maintenance schedules. German fighters often sat grounded for days or weeks awaiting fuel deliveries. When German pilots did fly, they operated knowing that Allied numerical superiority, performance advantages, and unlimited resources made survival unlikely over time regardless of individual skill. Allied pilots flew with confidence born from material superiority. They knew their aircraft were faster, their fuel was plentiful, their industrial base could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that maximized combat effectiveness. German pilots flew defensively, attempting to survive rather than achieve victory, knowing each engagement might end their war permanently. The technical specifications of 150-grade fuel reveal why this advantage proved so decisive. The fuel's performance number of 150 meant it could withstand 50% more compression than pure isooctane before detonating. This allowed engines to run at higher manifold pressures, which directly translated to increased horsepower. The Packard Merlin V1657 generated 1,720 horsepower at war, emergency power with 150-grade fuel compared to 1,490 horsepower with 130-grade fuel. This 230 horsepower increase, representing a 15% power gain, transformed combat performance across the entire flight envelope. Maximum speed increased by approximately 11 miles per hour at optimal altitude. Climb rate improved by roughly 300 feet per minute. Acceleration during combat maneuvers increased proportionally, giving pilots additional energy margin for aggressive tactics. Most importantly, sustained power output at combat settings lasted longer because engines could generate required thrust at lower operating temperatures and stresses. The fuel chemistry that enabled these advantages reflected sophisticated understanding of hydrocarbon behavior under extreme pressure and temperature. Creating 150-grade fuel required careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons, including toluene, xylene, and cumene, with alkylate base stock, adding precise quantities of tetraethyl lead as an anti-knock compound, and incorporating additives that prevented gum formation, controlled vapor pressure, and maintained stability during storage and handling. American and British petroleum chemists spent years developing optimal formulations through systematic testing of hundreds of blend variations. Each formulation underwent rigorous evaluation, measuring not just anti-knock performance, but also energy content, thermal stability, combustion characteristics, and compatibility with engine materials. The final specification represented accumulated knowledge from thousands of test runs, millions of dollars in research investment, and collaboration between government researchers, university scientists, and industry engineers. Germany possessed talented chemists and sophisticated research facilities, but lacked the natural petroleum resources, secure refineries, uninterrupted production, capacity, and time required to replicate Allied achievements. German synthetic fuel production from coal was technically impressive, but inherently limited. The Burgess process that converted coal to liquid fuel required enormous quantities of coal, high-pressure hydrogen, expensive catalysts, and massive industrial facilities that were vulnerable to Allied bombing. By 1944, Allied bombers systematically targeted German synthetic fuel plants, recognizing that fuel production bottlenecks represented Germany's most critical vulnerability. The bombing campaign against fuel infrastructure proved devastatingly effective. German aviation fuel production declined from 175,000 tons in April 1944 to just 35,000 tons in September 1944, a collapse that made sustained air operations impossible, regardless of aircraft or pilot availability. The final accounting demonstrates the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 groups across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties during 1944 and 1945. They claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These numbers represented not just aircraft destroyed but also pilots killed, experience lost, and German industrial capacity wasted building replacements that were themselves destroyed before achieving strategic effect. 150-grade fuel was not solely responsible for these outcomes, but it contributed significantly. The purple-dyed gasoline represented the margin of superiority that made the difference between close fights and decisive victories. The 448 miles per hour that properly boosted P-51 seconds could achieve was not just velocity, but also technological superiority, industrial capacity, and strategic advantage. Stigler survived the war, as did many other German fighter pilots who recognized when fights could not be won and chose survival over futile gestures. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Stigler spent time in Allied custody before eventually emigrating to Canada, where he worked as an aircraft designer. Years later, he participated in veterans' gatherings, where former enemies met as respected colleagues, sharing experiences and acknowledging professional competence across national boundaries. At one such gathering in the 1980s, Stigler discussed his wartime experiences with a group that included American P-51 pilots. When conversation turned to the Mustang's performance, Stigler recounted his encounter above the Ruhr Valley in August 1944, describing how an American fighter had accelerated away from him with speed that seemed impossible. An American pilot explained about 150 grade fuel, detailing the chemistry and engineering that had created such performance advantages. Stigler listened quietly, processing information that finally explained what he had witnessed 4 decades earlier. His response was simple and professional. "We never imagined such a thing was possible. We assumed American fighters performed within parameters similar to our own aircraft, limited by similar fuel and similar engineering constraints. Learning that you possessed fuel providing 15% more power changes the entire tactical picture. With such an advantage, you could choose every engagement, escape every unfavorable situation, maintain every advantageous position. Against such an advantage, we had no effective counter." This acknowledgement, delivered without bitterness or excuse, reflected professional recognition of engineering achievement and honest assessment of the performance gaps German pilots had faced. Other Luftwaffe veterans expressed similar sentiments when learning about 150 grade fuel's capabilities. The revelation did not change history, but it provided explanation for experiences that had seemed inexplicable during the war. The legacy of 150 grade fuel extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. The fuel represented American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and strategic vision. Creating such fuel required not just chemistry knowledge, but also industrial infrastructure, protected refineries, reliable supply chains, sufficient natural resources, and strategic planning that anticipated future needs months or years in advance. These capabilities reflected fundamental advantages that industrial democracies possessed over militarized authoritarian states, advantages that proved decisive when translated into military power. The story demonstrates how warfare at industrial scale involves more than tactics, strategy, or battlefield courage. Victory belongs to nations that can mobilize scientific expertise, industrial capacity, natural resources, and human capital more effectively than their opponents. American petroleum chemists working in laboratories never faced enemy fire, but their work helped decide who controlled European skies in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed his throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge with power that German fighters could not match, he benefited from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into competitive advantage. German planners had assumed American fighters would perform within predictable parameters based on aircraft design and standard fuel capabilities. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could not counter or comprehend. By spring 1945, as Allied armies overran Germany from east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. A few units still flew, often with barely enough fuel for single sorties. Jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 represented technological achievement, but they came too late, in too few numbers, handicapped by fuel shortages and the absence of experienced pilots who had been systematically destroyed in combat against opponents with every advantage. The air war ended with absolute Allied supremacy. This supremacy had many causes, including the P-51's exceptional range, excellent American pilot training, overwhelming numerical superiority, and superior logistics. But the petroleum engineering advantage that 150-grade fuel provided was significant and decisive. The purple-dyed gasoline turned good fighters into exceptional fighters, gave Allied pilots confidence, and represented accumulated technological and industrial might of nations that could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outlast their opponents. Speed matters in aerial combat. A faster fighter controls engagement geometry. A faster fighter has tactical flexibility that slower opponents lack. When American fighters became demonstrably faster through the combination of excellent airframe design and superior fuel chemistry, Luftwaffe tactical options narrowed dramatically. The acknowledgement from German pilots that Mustang performance seemed impossible reflected professional recognition of advantages they could not overcome through skill, courage, or tactical innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.